My name is Bruce Lowry. I run the grants team at the Skoll Foundation. We welcome to this, I guess this is technically the first session, not the opening plenary, is pretty amazing. First session this morning. I have been here at Skoll for a long time. I was at a separate group called the Skoll Global Threats Fund, and one of the issues, we worked on climate change and a number of other really complicated issues. And one of the things we worried about was risk literacy. And how do you get people to care about something they can't see, they can't smell, they can't taste, happens to somebody else? And that's climate change, right? It used to be pandemics. People now know what pandemics are, but for many people they were very conceptual. We also worked on nuclear weapons. That was very conceptual. So it's very hard to get people to care about things they don't feel, right? And so how do you get people to care? How do you get people to think about and feel about things? Well, you try to make them real, right? And you try to get data, evidence. How do you get people in power to act? If there is no data and evidence, it's very hard. You can't hold people accountable. And so these, transparency and evidence and data and accountability have been throughout the climate movement for a long time. But they're not something people tend to think about, I think, on a sort of daily basis. You're stuck on other things like parts per million and so on. So this could be a really interesting panel, I think, for folks. So we will get launched. I have to do the few things that I need to remind people on logistics or tell people since this is the first session. So please silence your cell phones. During the Q&A, this is being recorded, so please wait for a microphone so that we get your questions. It's being translated in French and Spanish, so you can get that on the Hop-In app if you would like that. On social media, we are using the hashtag SkollWF, so if you're tweeting or posting in some way, that would be great. We have surveys on the seats, so please fill those out when you're done. At lunchtime, you may have seen it coming in downstairs, a bunch of delegate-led sessions here in this part of SAID, so we hope you can look at that list downstairs and maybe join some of those. And I think that's it. So I'm going to turn this over now to kick this off, Gillian Caldwell, who many of you know, I hope, from her various incarnations at Skoll, but she is now running climate at USAID. And Gillian.
Thanks, Bruce, and good morning or good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world, to so many of you. Today's panel titled Transparency and Accountability, Clearing the Way for Climate Action. But unfortunately, I don't think we've had much transparency and accountability, and that's why we're in the mess that we are today. So I'm going to kind of walk you through what I mean by that. Let's start with this 1912 article from Popular Mechanics. The title was Remarkable Weather of 1911, the Effect of the Combustion of Coal on the Climate, What Scientists Predict for the Future. Now imagine if we had started taking action over a century ago in 1912. The fossil fuel industry made sure that we wouldn't. So since then, we have had literally decades of disinformation. In 1968, an American fossil fuel lobby, known as the American Petroleum Institute, began commissioning research on carbon dioxide. And their own researchers told them in no uncertain terms that atmospheric carbon dioxide was rising, that fossil fuel combustion was by far the most likely source, and that the consequences would be severe. So they knew this, and yet, throughout the 70s and 80s, they hired scientists to propel disinformation about this reality. And it worked. By 2016, a poll showed that 60% of Americans doubted whether or not climate change actually existed. Actually, no, that's 2006. Since 2016, we've had multiple lawsuits. So when we start to turn from the lack of accountability and information, the focus on disinformation to accountability, we see lawsuits starting to roll out around 2016, which take a page out of the tobacco litigation, basically saying you knew what the consequences were going to be, you continued your business model anyway, and you should pay your fair share for the consequences. And, of course, there's conversation Not enough action, though, on the question of price on carbon, which would make a big difference in the context. Next up, net zero commitments. So, according to the UN, net zero means cutting greenhouse gas emissions to as close to zero as possible, offsetting only hard-to-abate emissions. So we've seen a real surge in these commitments. In fact, more than 70 countries covering 83% of global emissions, as well as thousands of businesses and cities and educational institutions have net zero commitments. And some, but far from all, are applying the science-based targets to their commitments on this front. But we need transparency and accountability with respect to these commitments. And, importantly, we need the big companies to start paying attention to the accounting standards which require that they factor climate into their own business accounts. And the big four accounting firms are not insisting on that, and companies, by and large, are not doing that, which is why we don't have the kind of impact on the economy that we would. If these accounts actually reflected the price of carbon and impending climate impacts and risks, the economy would look incredibly different than it does today. Next up, our NDC commitments. I'm on the steering committee for the Nationally Determined Contribution Partnership, very sexy name. It's basically your commitments under the Paris Agreement if you're a country. Once again, we're in a tough spot when it comes to accountability and transparency here. By all accounts, we're not where we need to be to maintain what scientists identify as the safe threshold of 1.5 degrees C global warming. In fact, this is what's called an NDC reality check by the Climate Action Tracker. And as you can see here, no country is right now 1.5 C compatible. The best rating any country is getting is almost sufficient. And what about accountability for the NDCs, the commitments these countries make under the Paris Agreement? Well, every country is legally obligated, every signatory to the agreement is legally obligated to have an NDC to make commitments regarding mitigating their emissions and adapting to the consequences of this crisis. But there's no liability if you don't meet your commitments, no form of legal liability. It's not an enforceable commitment. What we have instead is the kind of court of public opinion, by which I mean the way you're viewed, potentially your access to resources and bilateral relationships. In most cases, there really is no accountability. I tip my hat to Colombia, however, which is one of the only countries in the world that has now enshrined their NDC into law. So they are obligated, at least according to the law, to deliver on their commitments. Last but not least, how about the transparency and accountability that we need with respect to civil society and its efforts to address this crisis, right? According to Global Witness, an estimated 1,700 land and earth rights defenders have been killed in the last decade alone. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, what about legal threats and repression and abuse? It's just absolutely unbelievable the price you pay for standing up for your life and your livelihoods, and for trying to ensure that we don't careen entirely off a cliff. So once again, we don't have sufficient accountability and transparency. What we have instead is impunity with respect to these assassinations in far too many instances, and the collusion between governments and their corporate counterparts that cause these kinds of problems. So, super cheery opening statement for everybody this morning. We've got all sorts of problems. We don't have transparency and accountability, which is why we are in the mess we are. We need to end the disinformation. We need to ensure legal accountability for climate harms. We need a price on carbon. We need real net zero commitments that are in fact met. We need you to reflect carbon in your accounts as you're legally obligated to do under FASB and other standards. Deliver on your NDCs. We would hold ourselves accountable to in the United States. You might have seen Biden just announce some very serious emission standards under the EPA that would dramatically propel the transportation industry towards fully electric vehicles. and we need to end the impunity for oppression. So in today's panel, we will be hearing from a lot of people who are ensuring that we have the transparency and accountability we need to tackle this crisis. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Gillian, for a very cheery start to our mornings, everyone. Hi, I'm James Mwangi. I'll be moderating, not really a panel, this sequence of presentations, after which we'll go into a panel. I'm the founder of the Climate Action Platform Africa and CEO of African Climate Ventures. There's a climate theme in my work now, so I'm really interested in what we're going to hear. Gillian, you talked a lot about some of the things we need to do, one of which was end disinformation. And a natural place to start with ending disinformation is getting better information on what's actually happening to our climate. And I can't think of a better person to prime us in that direction than Skoll.org Tasso Azevedo of Map Biomas. I'll invite you to come up and tell us what's actually happening.
Brazil, 5th largest greenhouse gas emitter in the planet. Surprise, right? The first four, China, US, India, and Russia, they are there in this list because of burning of fossil fuels. Brazil, we are there because of land use. 75% of our emissions, 7 to 75% of the emission comes from the way we use the land. Cattle, cropland, deforestation, and so on. So, and amazingly, we have been working for 10 years to measure all the greenhouse gas emissions in Brazil for all sorts of emissions. And the one that was the weakest information was land use, because it's very difficult to understand exactly what is happening with the land use and land use change. So that's the challenge that we have been tackling since 2015, which is to understand how the land is moving, the use of the land is moving in the country. Not just deforestation, which is a process, but what happened after that and how the things are moving in the country. So we put out a network of organizations, including universities, NGOs, and tech startups that are jointly producing maps of Brazil over the time for every year since '85. And the way we do this is that we broke the country in pieces of 30 by 30 meters. So Brazil has 9.6 billion pieces of 30 by 30 meters. And our goal is to tell the story of each one of those pieces over the time, since '85 to the days today. So we do this by using the archive of Landsat, satellite image, and we broke down to the level of each pixel, and we try to classify each pixel over the time, since '85, using tons of machine learning, the cloud computing, and all this stuff. So at the end, we produce these maps. So you can see here, all the land use in Brazil. There is 29 classes of use. So you have like forests, mangrove, agriculture, and then we broke down agriculture into different types of crops and pastureland, mining, urban areas, and etc. So each pixel is classified over the time like this. So if you click anywhere in the map, like for example this one, we click here in Mato Grosso, and then we have the story of that pixel. See, like it was a forest in '85, in '97 it was converted into pastureland, clear-cut pastureland, and then in 2001 it was converted to soybean, and has been soybean since then. Because we have the history of each of the pixels, the 9.6 billion, then you can join all of them and you can see the story. Like if you play, you see the story, how the thing is changing over the time, which is our end goal, right? Why? Because there are certain changes that results in emissions, and there are certain changes that results on carbon sink. So if we want to solve this question in Brazil, and we want to leave that 5th place to be like carbon neutral or something like that, we have to solve that. Right, okay. So because we have a map for each year, so this is one municipality in the Amazon in '85. So we have the situation in every year. So this is '85. Everything you see in green is forests and natural environments. Yellow is pastureland, for example, and pink is cropland. In this case, most of them soybean. And this is today, right? Big change, right? Okay, so if you see the history of that, can I go down here? Yeah. So see pastureland, more or less like stable, right? Cropland growing very fast, forests going down. Now you say, oh, then cropland is substituting forests. Not like that. Actually, what's happening is that forest is being converted to pastureland, and pastureland has been converted to cropland. So the idea of having all the stories, so then you can really understand what is the process that's happening if you want to interfere on that, right? Okay. And if you combine any pair of years, you can understand what is the change. What is the peaks of that change and what is the change that happened? And you can get down to know how much of the forest was converted to soybean, for example, during this period and things like that. So you got it, right? So that's the basic material use, and this is, I want to talk of some applications of that, of this level of data to a kind of act. So first one, obviously, deforestation. That's the first thing we think when we see this data. So we, apart from kind of having the deforestation every year, we also check every single sign of deforestation that is made up in Brazil, like with Global Forest Watch, with the official data from INPE and other organizations. We take each deforestation and we check in high resolution imagery and produce a kind of report for each deforestation showing an image before, an image after, and what happened there, like if it's a protection area, if it has authorization, or have authorization, etc. So in the last 4 years, we produce almost 300,000 reports on deforestation, like 2,000 reports per week. And so now these reports are being used by the banks, for example, to stop any money going to areas that have been recently deforested. So the banks that are responsible for 80% of the credit loan for agriculture are now stopping any money to go to flow for those places. So this is one simple application of that. By the way, all this information is open for anyone to use and free and so on. Then the second interesting is the opposite side, right? Is regeneration. Like we have this goal in Brazil to have 12 million hectares of restoration, right? And so we decided, okay, since we have all the maps for every year, how about if we calculate how much is the regeneration, right? And so we were able to actually find out every single piece of land that is regenerating with a year. So you know what's the age of the regeneration. And we find out 46 million hectares of regeneration. Like our goal is to have 12 million, and actually we have 46 million. Great, right? Yeah, but those areas is being clear-cut 10 times faster than the primary forest. And we're not even talking to that. So yeah, planting trees is very important. But how about if we take care of the natural regeneration? It's much more effective on the process that we want. So this is very important for the policy decisions of where we put our money in terms of conservation. 2 minutes. Fire. It's another one. Like we always heard about fire in Brazil, right? So we always track fire, like where is the fire happening? Now what we're interested to know is what actually is burning, right? Because we have the information of the land use over the time, we can track what is burning and what is the size of the areas that is burning. And we got this staggering number that in the last 30 years, 19% of the land in Brazil has burned at least once. And half of that burned twice in this period. Why this is important? If you burn once, for example, in the Amazon, it gets about 10 to 12 years to regrow. If it burned twice on the same period of 10 years, then it takes 30 years to repair. And this is all emissions. And the other interesting things that we find out is that 2/3 of this fire is happening on natural environments, on forests and natural grasslands and so on. And this is man-made. So this should be a count in our greenhouse gas emissions, and it's not there, because fire is normally considered like an accident that we should not count. So this is extremely important for the definition of policies in our side. The other one, almost the last one, degradation. So the main use of land in Brazil is pasture. Like 20% of the country is planted as pasture, right? The problem is it's a very weak way to use the land. So what we try to do is to classify how we use the pasture land. And so we have like land which has no degradation, pasture land that is no degraded, no signs of degradation. It's actually has a carbon sink. It's sinking carbon. But if you have degradation, moderate or severe degradation, it's actually release carbon. So the difference is the same land use, but depending on the way you're using, is a completely different result, right? So we find a way to map this over the time, showing what is happening. We are degrading the land or we are repairing the land. So at the first time, we have to end. the first thing when you see here is like, this is 2000, 2020, right? On 2000, you see like the green stuff here is how much we had on no degraded pasture, right? And then you see that this is growing, and the heavy degraded pasture is coming down. At first sight, when you see that, you say, wow, that's a very good news in Brazil, right? Not, unfortunately not. Most of what is happening is that the degraded pasture has been converted to agriculture. So you take this land, it's very, very low cost, repair the land, and then once you repair the land, go to agriculture that you get much more money. And what's growing here is the new frontier of deforestation in the Amazon. When you clear cut the forest, you put pasture. On the first years, you don't see sign of degradation. And then you see just later on. So actually, although you see something that seems to be like the government promote this as like, yeah, we are doing good, not so well. So very important to understand the history to actually know if we are doing the right thing or not. I would jump water. There is big things here, but I would jump because I don't have time. All of this information is totally open in the website. Anyone can go and grab, even for profit use, etc. And also all the codes that we use to produce the data. So the idea is that as many people as possible can use the data, but also can reproduce what we are doing. And this strategy was very important to make this happen in other realities. And that's one thing that's very important. When you are mapping things, you have to map something that really matters at the local level. So although global initiatives of mapping everything is really cool, it's really important that maps are made locally. And people that are making the maps understand what they are mapping and for why they are mapping those things. So our strategy is to make this happen in every tropical country. So now we have groups working with Mapioma's strategy throughout South America and also Indonesia. And our aim, our ambition is to go all over the tropics, everywhere, having people with capacity to produce the same type of data that we are producing in Brazil. That's the team. Thank you.
So if I'm reading the crowd correctly, you should be seeing a spike in traffic to the Mapbioma site. Those 30 by 30 tiles and the story of the data and actually making it clear what's factually happening, particularly over time, is really powerful. But it gains its true power from being in the hands of communities that can actually interact with the data and make decisions about how they're using their land and how they're deploying their activity. And Sonkita, Conteh, at Namati, that's exactly the kind of work you're doing in Sierra Leone and elsewhere. Would love to hear a little bit from you about how we drive transparency and accountability through to the community.
Thank you very much, James. Good morning. Yes. In 2018, a community in southern Sierra Leone faced a crisis. Their forests was bleeding trees at an alarming rate for them. Power saws had replaced machetes, and so they had to do something. They convened a meeting, and they agreed to develop a set of rules. The top priority for them was to stop business logging, which was fueled by charcoal burning. So the men, women, and chiefs agreed to stop deforestation in their community at some loss to themselves. And they agreed to form a committee to implement what they had set. Not even the chief, the paramount chief, could stop or reverse the rule. Now, that same year, we had a new government in Sierra Leone. And one of the first things the government did was to set up a committee to develop a framework that was transparent and accountable to aid deforestation, to aid timber logging. It's quite ironic that the community was addressing the problem in a positive way, but then the new government was moving in the opposite direction. Now, what happened in 2019 was that the government succeeded. And in that year, more than 10 million trees were felled and exported to Asia. We got $25 million as revenue from the sale of our forest resources. And in that process, we succeeded in destroying tens of thousands of acres of forest cover across the country. This is the picture in Sierra Leone. Communities, on one hand, are trying to address the issues that they confront on a daily basis. But governments, since independence, going in the exact opposite direction. Sierra Leone has had its heydays in terms of forest management. 50 years ago, we had 60% of forest cover. Today, what is left is less than 5%. And the primary driver for that has been mining, plantation agriculture, and of course the timber trade. The government thinks it can derive resources from destroying the forests that communities have relied on. And interestingly, in the last 15 years, the government has set up the Environment Protection Agency to protect the environment. They've also set up the National Protected Area Authority to protect the forests. And then recently they set up the Ministry of the Environment to coordinate all of these bodies. But the reality is that our environment, our forests are in the worst shape that they have been in the last 50 years. So what does community want? What do community want? Communities don't want to sit down and play host to investments that harm their environment. They want to have a voice. They want to be able to determine what happens on their land. They want to be able to apply their customary rules to manage their forests and conserve their resources. They want to be able to say yes or no to investments that come to their land. And if they say yes to the investment, they want to be able to determine the terms on which that investment occurs. That is not difficult from their perspective. It makes sense because they're the most affected when these investments don't pan out. And they are the owners of those resources, they're the owners of the land. But since independence, governments have played an outsized role in those kinds of decisions. They can license out land for mining and agriculture, and communities have had little or nothing to say about those. And when the protests, and we've had so many of those protests in the past, what has happened is that the government has used its powers, right? It used the police, the military to quell those protests. And so we've had killings, we've had arrest and detention of community members who protested against the abuse of their rights. But it is not all doom and gloom. Something unthinkable happened last year. And what was that? After a decade of blood, sweat, and tears, struggles, communities prevailed on the government to pass a law, the Community Land Rights, the Customary Land Rights Act, which brings in a range of provisions that hopefully will reverse where we are currently. So one of the first things it provides is that all land under customary law is now vested in the communities and the families that own those lands. If you require land for investment, there has to be free, prior, and informed consent of the communities. The government no longer determines what happens to the land. Any company that is undertaking investment should be bound by environmental conditions between them and the communities, not between them and EPA. And women have been given rights. They're now part of land management committees. They are now able to represent their families in discussions around land. So this is great news. It's a major milestone for Sierra Leone. But then it happened because communities came together and forced the government's hand to ensure that this prevailing situation does not continue. So in Sierra Leone now we have a great law. What is exercising our minds is implementing the law. And I think we stand a better chance right now as a country to help reverse the effects of climate change because we are now bringing communities into the picture. Communities like the one I just mentioned in the south of Sierra Leone that actually took action on the ground. They could take action and they could also hold government accountable. But the reality is that in many parts of the world, there are many communities that are disempowered, that cannot determine what happens to their land. They have to play second fiddle to leadership, to government institutions, and that needs to change. If we are to have the faintest opportunity or chance of tackling the effects of climate change, we cannot depend only on technocratic solutions or technological solutions. We need communities like the one in the south of Sierra Leone to be part of the discussion, to be actively involved. Then and only then would we be in a position to make a success of all the efforts we're trying to undertake right now. And I think we can achieve that, but it depends on all of us, wherever we are, in whatever country, in whatever territory, in whatever community. Our voice is important to ensure that those who are most directly affected, those who own these resources, are not marginalized, are not kicked out of the discussion. They are given a role to play within this space. Thank you very much for your attention.
Sonkita, thanks for that example of giving communities the tools they need to hold their public officials to account and to actually protect their rights and their ability to protect nature. Now, very often when communities are engaged in this struggle, arrayed on the other side are not just public sector or governmental interests, but corporate interests, pursuing shareholder value, however narrowly defined. Arianne, Griffith, at Global Witness, you've dedicated a lot of your time to understanding how to drive transparency and accountability among corporations in terms of their activity. I invite you to talk a little bit about that work.
Thanks, James, and it is wonderful to be here. I'm going to use my 8 minutes to talk about legislation as a way of advancing corporate accountability for climate-related harms. As we get into it, I want to talk a little bit about last year, because last year, the 5 largest private sector oil and gas companies together recorded profits of $195 billion US. It turns out that wrecking the planet is incredibly good for business. So then, why would these companies ever change what they're doing? Or more importantly, given what's at stake, how can we make them change? We're already seeing the impacts of our changing climate, from forest fires to floods to ever more powerful storms. And we're already seeing that, we're already seeing that people who are standing up to defend their lives, their land, and their livelihoods are paying the ultimate price when they stand up against corporate power and harmful corporate projects. Global Witness recorded that 200 land and environmental defenders were killed in 2021 alone. That's 4 people every single week. And so, moving forward, we need to change at least 2 things. We need to fundamentally change how companies do business, and we need to increase the level of accountability of companies for their actions. And legislative and policy interventions are a really helpful way of doing both of those things. Because we've left it up to businesses to do it on their own, tried the voluntary route, it simply has not worked, and certainly hasn't worked at the scale that we need it to. So, legislation, corporate accountability legislation that delivers for the climate needs to include at least 3 core elements. 1, it needs to focus on actions, not words. 2, those actions have to be science-based and aligned with the aims and ambition and objectives of the Paris Agreement. And 3, we need to include a legal liability mechanism, legal accountability mechanisms. Otherwise put, it needs to have consequences. We need actions, science, and consequences. Because before I go any further, it's not just the fossil fuel companies. Our recent report called Runaway Risk, Global Witness's recent report called Runaway Risk, shows that in Manila Bay, in the Philippines, a new mega airport is being built in the middle of a biodiversity hotspot. And to build it, hundreds of families have been displaced, and the same ecosystems that we should be protecting and restoring in order to tackle climate change have been destroyed. Still, the Filipino developer and the 2 Dutch companies that are involved in constructing and ensuring the project have boasted about its environmental and social credentials. So, Global Witness, since 2019, has been campaigning alongside other civil society organizations in the EU for a new law that would help to hold companies accountable for their actions, that can help to prevent situations like the ones that we're seeing unfolding in Manila Bay. And EU lawmakers are debating that now. It's called the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CSDDD. And no, that does not get any more fun to say the more you say it. But it has the potential to be a groundbreaking piece of legislation because it will require companies to do due diligence, not for the risks to the business, but for the risk that business activities create for human rights, for the environment, for the climate. And so we want to see this progress. It also has the potential to be groundbreaking because it's set to apply across all sectors to companies that are doing business in the EU once they're over a certain size. But to deliver for climate, it has to include 3 things: action, science, and consequences. On action, this is important because we needed to tackle what I call the greenwashing machine, right? We need guardrails to tackle the greenwashing machine, the endless barrage of promises and claims that are so often coupled with total inaction from companies. And we're calling for climate to be included as one of the impacts that companies have to address as part of their due diligence. And due diligence is primarily preventative in nature. It aims to prevent harms, right? But simply put, it's a process, a continuous process that companies can use to assess and address their risks and those of their suppliers, their business partners, and other entities in their value chain that may be created for people and the planet. Now, due diligence is important because it prioritizes action. It gets us to move beyond commitments, making commitments to delivering on those commitments. And Sonkita talked about the importance of engaging with communities. We need to make sure that when they're doing due diligence, that we have continuous, safe, and meaningful engagement with communities. Otherwise, we're not going to get very far. Second, we need science-based, Paris-aligned plans and actions. We need, for starters, to include scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions. That's to say the emissions that the company itself is releasing, but also those that it causes to be released. So for fossil fuel companies, for the fossil fuel sector, 85% of its emissions are scope 3 emissions, the ones that are created when the product that it sells is used. And so leaving out scope 3 emissions is a glaring omission if this is to be a real climate plan and real climate action. We also need to drastically reduce emissions. The IPCC has told us that we need to halve global emissions by 2030, which means that in some sectors we need much more drastic cuts, and we need them now. So we need legislation to also include time-bound requirements for companies to act. We need it to prioritize short and medium-term targets and action from companies. Otherwise, not getting very far. And finally, before I get in trouble with the timekeepers and the moderator, we need legal accountability mechanisms. We've seen, and Gillian mentioned it in the opening, an increase in an uptick in cases that are brought against companies and states, but against companies for climate-related harms. What we're calling for in the CSDDD is the creation of a civil liability mechanism. that will allow people and communities to take companies to court for negative impacts on their human rights, environment, and climate. And the idea is not to take every company to court for everything that they do wrong. The idea is to create a credible threat of legal action for the companies that are threatening all of us with persistent inaction. And last, the reason we need a corporate accountability mechanism is to ensure access to justice for people and communities everywhere that are affected by corporate activities and corporate abuse of power. In closing, I want to stress that we can do this. We can change how companies do business, and we can hold them accountable for their actions. We're seeing a massive pushback against the CSDDD from the business lobby in Brussels, but we are also seeing companies coming forward, investors coming forward and supporting the CSDDD, because sustainability is the long game here. It will make for better business, and it ultimately will be better for business and for all of us. And so the CSDDD is the start. It's a building block. And we need to already start thinking about entry points in other jurisdictions, about how we standardize this approach, not just replicate, but standardize this approach across jurisdictions. Because our shared futures, those of our children and our children's children, depend on us coming up with new rules for business. And I dare say that it cannot wait. Thank you.
Arianne, thank you. I dare say that CSDDD did become more lyrical the more times you said it. So it does grow. It does a little bit.
We're on to something.
Yeah, not the first time I say it. I'm saying it and it's, I know, but yeah. So you talked about bringing the threat of legal consequence to bear on corporate interests. Paul, Radu, your work focuses on the kinds of people who are used to facing legal consequence and either subverting it or evading accountability altogether. Would love to hear how you think about this in the world of organized crime and corruption more broadly.
Thank you. And I mean, Gillian, Sonkita, Tasso, Arianne, I'm impressed. It's like you're trying to pry a lot of power and money from the hands of people who've ignored it for more than 100 years, right? This problem. And it seems to me that, you know, everything that you've talked here aligns with what we're doing at the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. And it seems to me that we can also help, we can contribute. And I'll try to explain how. Now, at OCCRP, we are this platform of investigative reporters working on 6 continents and investigating, as the name says, organized crime and corruption. We're very much focused on that for about 15 years. So we learned how the criminals work. We know how they operate. We know how they move from place to place and apply the same criminal models over and over again. As a result of our work, you can see some numbers here, but I want to point you to one of those, and it's actually a little bit bigger right now to date. We contributed to the recovery of more than $10 billion from the hands of the corrupt and the criminal. This is money that was seized by authorities, by law enforcement in many countries. Now, we're joking, and actually this is probably like a bit less than a quarter of the price of Twitter, isn't it? Or maybe half of the price of Twitter right now. Something like that, right? It's always changing. But we're joking at OCCRP that this amount here, if you look at the return on investment, you look at our budgets for the past 15 years and you look at this number, the return on investment is about 50,000%. This is better than drug trafficking, cocaine trafficking. This is how we're joking internet. Now, this number is not just us, and this is what I want to stress here. This is work that we triggered as investigative reporters, but it was the civil society organizations and the law enforcement and the companies and lawyers who are able to get to this result. Now, the problem in my view, is that, and it's obvious, criminals and the corrupt politicians don't want for good things to happen. They don't care about the climate. They don't care about the environment. They care only about the money. They don't care about us here. But what they are is they are very powerful, very creative, very resourceful, and they are audacious. And they are very innovative in the ways that they're doing business. And everything that they do touches, at the end of the day, the environment and has a huge impact on climate. And I'll give you a few very brief examples. But really, I mean, we're talking here about laws, about rules. We're talking about, trying to map what's going on with the forest in Brazil and elsewhere, and what happens with the land in general. And when I'm looking at the criminals, I'm seeing them trying to hurt all those areas as much as they can. So it got to a level, unfortunately, that we haven't seen the criminals, how they built their infrastructure for decades, starting in the 40s, 50s of last century. And they built up and built up and built up and built up, and they amassed huge amounts of money. Where do you think that money is going? It's going into purchasing. We all know about London, right, and the real estate there, but that's a small portion of that. A larger part goes into buying agricultural land, water surfaces, forests, and taking down those forests, and going about what you described in Brazil. So that's where we have to be very, very careful, because behind every of these, scourges, but behind every of these problems, there are humans and there are criminals and corrupt politicians who work hand in hand and who don't allow for the laws and the regulations to be implemented in the way that they should be implemented. Laws are good, but implementation is hard, and it's made harder by these criminals who work hand in hand with the corrupt politicians to make more and more money. So I'll give you a very brief example. I'm from Romania, and I'm from this part of Romania that's called Transylvania. This is an image from the mountains there, and this is an area where you have the last old forests in Europe. These are forests that stored a lot of carbon over many, many years. Now you see, it's less and less. I think we need to do that mapping, in this area as well, and we'll see it's less and less. And when you look at what's going on, you see there's a lot of illegal logging. People take down the forest. And there are lots of investigations locally. Law enforcement looks into it, and they arrest, a villager there, because they went, into the forest and they took down a few logs. But what the problem is that the logs, each of those families there, they store, a few logs, and they put them all together in a warehouse, and all those logs go to a corporation that's based in Austria. Now, it's more than that, because you say, well, people need to make a living, and this is the only way that they can make money, and so on. But it's a very, very interesting system where the corporation itself gave loans to the local population to buy tools to cut down the forest. So they said, we're going to loan you, give you this money, and you're going to go out and cut the forest. And guess who's the buyer for all those logs? The corporation. Now, the corporation was never investigated officially. We exposed it. They lost some, their certification with the stewardship forest and things like those. So things happened. But the system is very, very insidious. So you see these people here, Toader Timiș, Grigore Timiș, some people, some villagers from that area that are in jail for this crime, but in reality, they're not the guilty ones. The guilty ones are the organizers of all this. So how do we get to that? Now, at OCCRP, what we're trying to understand and to expose is the toxic supply chains, how criminals insert themselves into these supply chains, how they use their power and money at every step of the way in order to make more money. We've identified, for the past 5-10 years, quite a few what we call criminal angel investors. Imagine a Jeff Skoll who's financing climate destruction instead of financing what you're doing right here. So that, unfortunately, happens quite a bit, and this is what we're trying to expose, and we built over the past 15 years the tools, the strategies, and I'm talking here about investigative strategies, investigative tools, security tools, because this is dangerous work for activists, as we've seen, lots of people die investigating this type of matters, and we are prepared and ready to put them at your disposal. These tools and our strategies and our knowledge. And I believe that together we can make a bigger dent. We can go from that 10 billion to a much higher amounts, and we can actually protect the environment in a way that hasn't been done before. So I think it's with these tools that we've created, and with the goodwill, and with your brains, with your experiences, that we can move along and actually stop the corrupt and the criminal from doing business as usual. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. That was a pretty robust ROI you were outlining there. How do I invest in this whole business model? I'll invite all of our speakers. Please, first of all, a hand for each of them for their presentation, and we'll Thank you. Oh, thanks. This is me. Let's keep in order. Thank you. So I think we've got just about 15 minutes. So I want to spend most of that time opening up to the audience. But maybe to kick off, each of you have talked about both the imperative of greater transparency and accountability, some of the levers and some of the actors that need to be engaged. I did notice a common thread, though, that struck me, which is a lot of this was about how we create transparency and accountability to stop bad behavior that is making the climate problem worse. I am increasingly struck by the fact that given where we are today, and Gillian, you made a powerful point about 1911, we already saw this, that might have been enough. Stopping bad behavior from 1911 might have been enough to get us to a more sustainable future. But we no longer have it as sufficient just to stop the bad stuff. We have a lot of new things that need to be done or built. We need to change the entire system of production and consumption around the world in a new way. And I am curious about how you think about those very same tools, not just from the stopping of the bad, but also the fostering and accelerating of the good, because the danger is we might actually end up with the, kind of the NIMBYism challenge, where we need to build new types of energy infrastructure that is clean, but all of the same tools that stop things from being done until you have the buy-in can actually slow that down in ways that no one intends. But at the same time, you want to create that voice. So I did want to open it out and hear a little bit about that flip side as perhaps a starting point. It's an open question. Anyone want to dive in? Gillian and then Arianne.
I mean, I think it's worth noting that we've invested more in fossil fuels and fossil fuel subsidies for a long time than we have in creating the incentives that we need to transition the economy. So for starters, let's stop investing in suicidal ways. And let's start investing in what we need to propel the transition forward. As I also mentioned, a price on carbon would make a really big difference, because all of these companies are externalizing their costs, and we're the ones forced to absorb them. So the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States is a good example of the kinds of moves we need to make, where it's $368 billion of tax incentives and investments in the kind of future we need to build. Some in Europe have complained it's protectionism, to which I think I would respond, why don't you make some investments to incentivize this kind of transition in your own countries? Because that's what we all need to be doing instead of investing in the wrong direction. So I think we don't have, we're not establishing the right economic signals, and notwithstanding that, solar is still cheaper than the fossil fuel alternatives in almost all of the 80 countries where we're working right now. So market demand is rising even as the price of bringing renewables online falls.
Great. So there's an incentive question. Arianne, how are we creating accountability for achieving the good instead of just accountability for stopping the bad?
Yeah, absolutely. It feels a little bit like that movie, We need everything, everywhere, all at once.
Yeah.
It's with due diligence and human rights and environmental due diligence. It's not just about the bad. It's also about systemically changing how companies assess and respond to and address the risks that are created to human rights and the environment, including the climate, and kind of making sure that is a positive driver. It's not just about stopping the harmful actions and holding them accountable for those, but it's about forward-looking as well, this active, ongoing process, a continuous process of identifying and assessing those risks, and then taking action to change them. And that I think of as a positive way of approaching it as well, that can add to this, and won't be the only thing that we need to do as a society, and as countries and as a global community. But certainly for companies, that is an incredibly helpful place for them to start.
Okay. Just add one thing. It's interesting, right? We have now this legislation in Europe to don't get anything from deforestation on the supply chain, etc. And one of the things that we see is that one way for companies to deal with that is basically disengage. So they say, I don't buy anything from the Amazon, and then I don't have to care about that, right? So just don't think of it. And we're always saying like this is not at all the solution, because when you disengage, then you have no incentive for transformation, right? So I think one thing that is important is like, and I was recently in the European Parliament talking about this, and I said, well, it's welcome, the legislation, but we have to have a legislation that actually incentivizes companies to do business with the Amazon, but focusing on what we call forest-compatible products. For example, do you know that pineapple comes from the Amazon originally? Like how much of the pineapple in the world is actually traded from the Amazon? 0.4%. 0.4%. Do you know that cocoa comes from the Amazon originally? How much of the cocoa in the world is actually coming from the Amazon? Almost nothing. So it's really important that we actually engage with those areas, talking with the products that can be done sustainably and not just simply disengage.
Yeah. Great. So I'll take 2 sets of questions or comments, keeping them very, very short. We will go, I'll take one. There's a lot of gentlemen who want to speak. So 2, and the lady over there in the first round. So we'll go the gentleman over there, and then we'll come back, and I saw the gents who are all keen to speak. We'll get you in the next round.
Thanks very much. Phil Blummer from the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre. And thanks ever so much to the panel. It's been a really excellent session. I just wanted to bring in the issue about critical minerals, and particularly this issue of the extraordinary rise in demand that we're going to see over the next 20 years, where the International Energy Agency suggests that we're going to need 6 times the rate of extraction, even with the kind of recycling that we desperately need to build in. The business model at the moment, just simply as the panel has described, has just builds enormous distrust. So switching that business model, forcing companies to really accept, first of all, models of shared prosperity, models where there is social protection for those that are affected, but also where there is consent and consultation with communities. How do we build, what do you see as the most powerful levers that we've got to shift that business model of the major mining companies that are involved and will be involved in this massive level of extraction?
Thank you.
Upon us?
Lady over here.
Hi, I'm Beth Chepemisi, and I work for SDI, which is the Slum Dweller Organization. I'm very interested in the link between the impacts of deforestation and access to a fuel for domestic use in informal settlements. And I see the link because a lot of the deforestation that happens in some of the cities is about creating charcoal for use in neighborhoods. But oftentimes these two issues are delinked. So a solution for fuel in the informal settlements would ensure that there is no deforestation for charcoal. I'm just interested in where you see opportunities to actually address these issues in a way that is continuous and that links what's happens in rural communities and what is happening in the urban areas.
One more.
Can you hear me? Oh, my name's Yolanda Wright. I work for Give Directly, and I really appreciate a lot of the comments from the panel. And what I wanted to particularly pick up on is I think that the land rights and the fundamental rights of communities living next to the most valuable natural resources is so paramount and so fundamental to kind of creating a rights-based approach to this. I just wondered if you had any comments about how do we get funding directly to people in that situation so once they get land rights, how do we help them? Because we know that the economics is it's far better to leave some of those resources standing in many ways, but economically, those people have the least power in this equation. And so, I mean, for Give Directly, I'd love to see how we can try to be transferring resources, especially climate finance, which so rarely seems to reach actual communities on the front line. I'd just love to hear some views.
Awesome. So critical minerals, clean cooking, or the challenge of cooking, which is one of the biggest drivers of deforestation, rural, urban, and how do we engage with the land rights for communities, trying to get through these in time to get at least one more round of 1 or 2 questions. So who wants to go first?
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the questions. I think what is critical is getting more than one player into the room. And in our experience, it's been mostly the government calling the shots and running things to the detriment of communities. And so I believe that if we give communities the opportunity to exercise their rights, then many things would flow in their direction. One of the things we're looking to do in Sierra Leone this year and in the coming years is seeking to get communities more benefits from keeping their forests. Currently, there are too many middle organizations and middlemen who are sapping whatever is coming into communities, and at the end of the day, what comes in is nothing to write home about. But we would like to see these communities getting the most from this carbon financing and things like that, because it's important for them to have that. If you're going to tell them to maintain their forests and not deplete it or use it in a sustainable way, there has to be ways of supporting them to do that. And I think, again, there's a tension around, we need fuel for cooking, and we cannot afford perhaps gas in many of the informal settlements. In our experience, we've seen communities being able to manage how they use fuel for firewood as fuel for their daily living versus how governments basically open the doors for companies to go in. I mean, imagine if you cut down 10 million trees in a single year and you export that to Asia, what that would do to your forest, as opposed to communities being able to have trees that they can cut down for their use in their daily living. That is a far cry. And I think communities don't want that to happen. They don't want to see their forests depleted. They can manage, and for centuries they've had rules on how to use these resources sustainably. In one community, for example, they have rules around not cutting down trees along the river and not cutting down very young trees. So they can manage these dynamics. But unfortunately, governments have not been giving them the opportunity to do so.
Okay. Paul?
Yeah, if I may add a bit to this, especially in terms of land use, I think the partial solution to that, the beginning of a solution, is to try to understand what is really going on there, knowledge. And that means, in my opinion, and I'm biased, that we need to transfer a lot of investigative power to the local level. The locals, the people need to know what is going on. I've seen last night a great film, The Descendant. It was really about, people who had power over land over hundreds of years. And those lands became toxic because this rich family, sold the land to corporations who were going about toxicity, these toxic businesses. It's really about understanding what is going on, who owns the land, what's the history of that land. And I believe, investigative power can help in that and can trigger other type of action with that.
Gillian?
Yeah, so briefly on the green minerals, I think really important point. Two things I'd say. One, my colleague Shannon Johnson in the back, we've got a grand challenge on ending corruption in green mineral supply chains, and we've been sourcing a range of innovations around the world, and we'll be investing in ending corruption in green mineral supply chains. That's really important. We also have something called the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act in the United States that prohibits the importation of products such as solar panels that are understood to have been produced with slave labor. The challenge there, of course, is Xinjiang in China, which is where 90% of solar panels and components are produced worldwide. I mean, we have a real problem with supply chains. The PRC does have a lockdown on the vast majority of the green mineral supply chains, and not known for their environmental and social due diligence standards. So there's a huge job to be done on that front. And briefly on localization, at USAID we have a localization agenda which is focused on quadrupling the amount of funding we're providing to locally based organizations rather than to large international NGOs who have typically benefited from our support. The challenge that we face is that, of course, when you're talking about grants of the size that we're providing, there needs to be infrastructure, and especially where indigenous people and local communities are concerned, that infrastructure doesn't typically exist. So I'm going to be convening a broad range of governments to talk about best practices in terms of ensuring we can get funding to the local level, which I think needs to be partially through indigenous intermediaries that provide fiscal sponsorship and front office support, where grassroots organizations don't want to reinvent themselves as part of the NGO industrial complex.
Many things that we could talk about the mining. We are mapping the mining in a very detailed, so I want to follow up on this later on, but I'm not getting. I just want to get to the point of the use of wood, because I think this is one of those interesting things, which is like in Brazil there is a lot of use for firewood in the northeast of the country. That's basically where it's concentrated. And so what we are seeing as the solution is not like to substitute the use. On the contrary, is actually to manage the forests in a way that we can have the wood, because we want them to continue to, we want people to continue to use the biomass, because it's better than try to shift to gas and other things until we can shift to electricity in a way. So I think this is like a key element is linked to that. As for the very directly response to you, I have two options. If you want to do this in large scale, there is Aman, which is one of the grantees this year. They are setting up a fund that they want to, the goal is $100 million, and it's totally run by the indigenous people with the, to develop projects on many areas, like demarcation of lines and etc. And very interesting that we have exactly the same thing happening in Brazil now with a Podai fund that's run by Coiabe, which is also wants to, the goal is $100 million, basically fully dedicated for demarcation of lands and development projects with the indigenous people. And it's run, those two funds are run by the indigenous people from top. From every single aspect, it's managed by them, so you can do this directly.
I suspect we are at time, but I am just checking. I can have 5? That is fantastic. So we will go here and the gentleman right there. Yes, you. And apologies to everyone else, just everyone.
Thanks to the panel for the insight. My name's Rosina Breen. I'm CEO and Editor-in-Chief at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, which is a non-profit newsroom in London. Our mandate is to spark change through our investigations, and we specialise in global health, the environment, big tech, and specifically climate finance and the Amazon. And I was just interested in your broader perspective about the part that public interest journalism has in the ecosystem especially for non-profit newsrooms, and what you would either like from us or where you're going in terms of Global Witness and OCCRP as well.
Okay, thank you. The role of...
Thank you. Patrick Alley at Global Witness. It's a question, I think, for Tasso. I saw you speak yesterday about another of your projects to bring the internet to indigenous communities in the Amazon, and I'm wondering whether you're building into that the chance for local communities to report on illegal incursions into their land, which sort of goes towards the work that Arianne talked about, and also Paul, in terms of perhaps reporting crimes to give information on supply chains, and also, of course, for their own security.
Great. Given that those were very pointed questions, I'll take one more right over here.
Thank you. Eloise Todd from Pandemic Action Network. I just wanted to salute, in a quick comment, the work that you do to stop the bad stuff happening, because I personally feel quite passionately that in the advocacy world, we often don't do enough of that, and we kind of want to make the positive case for change. So thank you for taking the risks that you do. It's much appreciated. And my question is, obviously, with a rising climate and deforestation, that increases the risk of zoonotic spillover and a rise in pandemic and epidemic threats. I wondered how, if you are thinking about the transparency and accountability and the community action from that pandemic threat perspective, and if not, we'd love to work with you and collaborate on that as we try to break down silos. There's a lot of talk about climate and health, but little in terms of what that actually means. So just wondered what your perspective is on that. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Eloise. Why don't we do it this way? Let's combine closing statements with any responses, and we'll go from Paul coming back this way. Gillian, you got us started. You will have the last word.
Okay.
Sure. So I think there's a very important role to be played by us as journalists, together with lots of other groups. These alliances across sectors are really the most important right now. We need to exchange more information. We need to exchange more tools. I mean, we created our investigative tools, but a lot of those are actually inspired by tools that were created in other fields. But this cooperation was too scattered. In order to make a difference, we need to be much more decided about this. These exchanges, these links between the organizations, between journalists and civil society and others should be much, much stronger. Now, this is strange to come from an investigative reporter. We want to keep our silos. We want to keep, the integrity of our investigative reporting. But it can be done, and we've done it through an alliance with Transparency International that functions for the past 7 years, and we've done it with Global Witness. And so this works. So we need to learn from each other as much as possible and to intervene at the local level in a sense that the local community gets these tools to do their own work. They are the primary. They're interested in changing how things are locally. And that's, I think, what we have to do. We have to cooperate, and we have to be relentless in our work to understand the problem and to tackle the problem with, everybody who has a vested interest in this. And lots of those people are not, don't have bad intentions. Lots of those people are actually people who are used in this drive to destroy the environment that's driven by criminal groups and corrupt politicians.
Thanks very much for the questions. Briefly on the link between environment and health, in terms of the current legislative initiative that we're working on, the CSDDD, there is a huge fight, which I don't have time to talk about, is which international standards will apply to companies, and what rules do we already have that we can that we can make companies respect. And one of the conversations that we're having now is trying to make sure that the right to a healthy environment is incorporated within the new directive. And another way that it's sort of coming up in our work now, certainly with this particular directive, is looking at what the EU calls the One Health approach, which they don't have a monopoly on, but are particularly interested in right now, and that's the connection between animal welfare and the environment and human health. And so also we're seeing that sort of theme coming into the directive and making sure that those things are coming closer together, which in the long term will be of course, better for all of us. On the question, in terms of from the VIJ, and your work is incredible, and everybody at Global Witness, I'm sure I can say, is a huge fan. I think that it's, picking up on what Paul was just saying, it's about us making sure that we work together to ensure the integrity of the information ecosystem. The work that, the stat that I shared at the start of the presentation on the profits that have been created, that have been generated by fossil fuel companies over the course of last year, is part of work that we're doing now, a new campaign that we're doing now, that's on kind of looking at the power that those companies have and making sure that the narrative that we build with evidence that we can put together and that we can publish and share is shifting the attention to where it needs to be and making sure that we understand who is responsible for this ongoing crisis, who is continuing to keep us in this position. And I think that that's work that it would be great for folks like Paul and his organization, and for you at the Bureau, and for us at Global Witness and others in that vein to collaborate on. And I'm sure that would be incredible to explore. Can I just say one thing, which is that if anybody, that was a bit long, in case anybody is working on legislative initiatives and that kind of movement in other jurisdictions, and kind of, legislative initiatives around corporate accountability, I'd love to talk to you. Thanks.
Thank you, James. Thank you, everyone. I think my last word is that what happens in your backyard no longer stays in your backyard. It affects backyards millions of miles away. And so because of that, it requires all of us to be part of this whole process, this whole fight, to ensure that communities are empowered, they are part of the decision-making process. It requires journalists, it requires doctors, it requires engineers to be part of this fight, to ensure that not just the governments or companies are at the table, that other voices are heard and their input becomes very relevant. Thank you so much for being here.
Great. Thank you. Just got to the question. The project that he was referring is like there is 1 million people living in 5,000 communities that protect 112 million hectares in Brazil, an area the size of Germany and France together, that are unconnected. So they're not they haven't access to internet and so on. So we set up this project with the indigenous communities and black communities leaders to put out internet in all those 5,000 communities in 3 years. It's a massive, crazy stuff that we're doing, and it's an idea of having the internet controlled by each community with their own rules of each community for that internet. So that's the thing. Yes, and there is 2 ways to do this. What you suggest. So there is one app that will go in that is being developed that allows for the communities to report anything that happens, but also there is something that we call the panic button. It's basically if there is a threat, an imminent threat to the community, we don't know if it's yet a physical or a digital thing, but literally it's a button that you press and then it triggers a series of actions that could help to protect them on those isolated places where they are. My last thing is like there are many things that we find out when you start to monitor things. One of the ones that I would just leave this because I think it kind of make us think about what we think is a good thing that maybe not exactly how we think. So as we are monitoring all the deforestation one by one in Brazil, like every single deforestation event we are checking, we start to see areas where people are clear-cutting forests to put solar panels, which is like the most freaking thing that you can imagine, right? So I'm just thinking that's not everything is like what we imagine when you're thinking about renewables and so on. So I think this is a reason for us to be kind of alert of what we are promoting, just to be sure that this is not just take for granted that it's good or bad.
Two brief notes and then a closing thought. Journalism, fundamentally essential. I actually worked on your strategic plan with Rachel, your predecessor, and USAID's invested quite a bit in journalism. And interestingly, we've launched a new insurance fund called Reporters Mutual, which is specifically focused on helping journalists deal with retaliatory lawsuits, which is a huge challenge, as was addressed earlier. To your point on pandemics, obviously we're going to see much more zoonotic transfer as wild animals are forced from their habitats. And one of my goals as USAID's Chief Climate Officer is to ensure that the 40 or 50 billion dollars we're managing, I think it was actually 30 to 40 billion last year, is programmed across the agency in a whole of agency way. So take global health, for example. We already have famine early warning systems through our humanitarian affairs team. We already have early warning systems around extreme weather events and also to inform farmers regarding planting and harvesting crops. And we're embedding into those existing systems pandemic early warning systems as well. So, my closing thought as you put the end note up is just to say, I know I began with some pretty depressing analysis of the lack of transparency and accountability, but the truth is that this is touching us all so deeply at every level of our lives, irrespective of what work we're doing. And the truth of the matter is that it's like this enormous potential to reinvent the way we're living our lives on every level. I mean, in order to address this crisis, it requires such a substantial reorientation that I think is really motivating. And I would just encourage those of us who feel depressed, as it's hard not to, by this crisis, to think about how you can engage. Because there's enormous opportunities and there is a lot of really good work being done every day.
On that note, Paul, Arianne, Sonkita, Tasso, Gillian, thank you so much, and thank you all for a great conversation.